Long-standing research tells us that reading is tied to brain development and that children's brains develop at different times. Thus, we know that typically developing children come to reading between the ages of 4 and 8. In this developmental approach, a child who's not reading independently at age 5 or 6 or even 7 is not necessarily behind. We are looking for markers that the child's moving through the stages of reading development, or conversely, signs that the child is not developing typically in reading. But we are not labeling struggling readers in kindergarten or first grade or even second grade if we are still seeing that growth happen and they are within the range of typical development. Some of the markers of typical reading development include turning the pages, understanding that text is read left to right in English, learning letters, learning letter sound associations, memory reading, chiming in on repetitive parts of the text, and enjoying stories. So those are some of the markers we're looking for to see that a child's reading is developing. It's also really important to note that reading is more than just decoding. A lot of times when people talk about, is my child reading yet? They mean decoding. Are they looking at the letters on the page and saying the word? But reading is much, much more than just decoding. And it's really ultimately about making meaning out of text. And it has many pieces that come together for that to happen. And decoding is just one of those pieces. Our approach at the Children's School combines phonics and phonemic awareness instruction with authentic reading and writing tasks and strong oral vocabulary. This is in line with the very latest research. So there is a historic debate about phonics versus whole word approaches to teaching reading. What we have learned as we've watched that pendulum swing back and forth over many, many years now is that actually there's a combination that needs to happen. From phonics, from the phonemic awareness work that we do in tandem with learning some sight words, those words in the English language that you cannot decode because they don't follow rules of phonics, and then rich oral vocabulary instruction so that when a student can decode a word, they know what it means. So we combine all of those in our classrooms, along with authentic reading and writing tasks that make reading, that motivate children and tap into their own curiosity and interest in reading and writing. The latest research shows that both of these components are needed for students to fully come to reading. That is not just decoding, not just sounding out words or recognizing sight words on a page, but making meaning out of text and using reading and using writing for their own purposes and their own learning. So authentic reading and writing tasks, probably one great example of this is story writing. So students at every grade level at the Children's School are dictating or writing their own stories. Then they are publishing those stories by reading them to their class. That is a powerful motivator for many children, reading their own words for their classmates to enjoy. We also use a lot of self-chosen reading materials. In a more traditional school, maybe you would have reading groups, and this group is using this textbook, and this group is using this textbook, and the children read the stories in the textbook one by one. In the Children's School, independent reading honors the child's desire to choose their own reading material. With guidance from the teacher, students will choose books that they want to read, just as adults do. We also model many different ways of using reading with a print-rich environment in the classroom. We rely on reading for many of our research projects and our emergent curriculum. Reading is hugely important in making these projects come to life. Projects are also a rich source of vocabulary building, so that goes with the decoding and sight word work, so that when students can read those words, they also know what they mean. We also have responsive teaching that responds to what children need in that moment. So teachers will notice what a child is struggling with or what a group of children are struggling with in reading, and then they will craft a lesson, maybe a mini lesson about that particular thing. So for example, the silent E, the magic E that makes the vowel say its name, that's something that a teacher could address in a short mini lesson with a small group of students if he or she notices that students aren't applying that rule correctly. For phonics instruction and phonemic and phonological awareness in kindergarten, that starts with a lot of rhyming games and songs and things that feel fun and silly, but they're really about understanding how to chunk words, how to remove the initial sound and replace it with a different initial sound. Same with middle sounds and end sounds. So learning letter sound associations, practicing, again, could be orally, could be in a group, could be one-on-one, or it could be in the child's own individual reading. Making sure that children have that grounding, letter sound associations, word patterns, spelling patterns. As they go up in grades, that becomes about patterns in English based on what language some of our words come from and understanding Latin and Greek roots so that you can use parts of a word to understand an unfamiliar word. So people sometimes ask me, what sign should I look for to know that maybe reading is not developing typically for my child? Here are a few answers to that. One is reversals or mixing up letters past age 8. So it is very, very common for children to mix up B and D, for example, and not necessarily a sign of a problem in the younger grades. But starting around 3rd grade, if a student is still making those reversals and really doesn't seem to be able to correct them when they're pointed out, that can be a warning sign. Also, difficulty with the sounds of language, so rhyming games, substituting or isolating the initial sound. If that is very hard for a 5 or 6-year-old, sometimes that is linked to a language processing issue. Also, reading struggles plus any family history of dyslexia or reading disability. Reading struggles plus a history of a speech language delay. And then the last one I'll mention is not a child who doesn't enjoy books or doesn't enjoy being read to. Typically that can be a sign that something is going on with comprehension, that they're not enjoying the books because they're not understanding what's being read. So those are some warning signs that we look for. They don't necessarily mean that something's wrong, but there's something that they might cause us to start exploring if there's something going on with development that's causing reading to be difficult. If a child is exhibiting difficulties with reading, whether there's a diagnosis of dyslexia or a learning disability or not, the next step is typically to put in place more structured, sequential, systematic, explicit phonics-based instruction. So if the children's school approach is to use phonics instruction to support and enrich the development of reading, but it's not to just work on phonics in isolation. So for a child who's struggling, they may need more structured, systematic phonics work. Supporting a struggling reader is always very individual. There are degrees of support. The first degree might be more one-on-one or small group teacher time within the classroom, or it might be some reinforcement at home of things learned in class. And then growing from that, it might be one-on-one or small group work with a learning specialist. And that could be once a week, twice a week, up to 5 times a week, depending on the degree of need. Another thing parents ask me a lot is, what can I do to support my students' reading development at home? My number one tip for that is to keep reading with your child for information and for enjoyment. Model reading life of your own. Let your child see you reading books that you enjoy and reading things to learn, and then keep on reading with your child. Even once your child can read to him or herself, even when your child is able to read independently, reading aloud with your child, taking turns, or helping them access a book that is above their instructional level but still something that you can enjoy together is a great way to nurture their reading development. For older grades, once students are decoding and reading sight words and making meaning out of texts. For older grades, the emphasis shifts to analyzing texts. So book clubs, literature circles, ways that children can learn about literary elements, plot and character and dialogue and themes, all those pieces that make reading, especially fiction, so interesting and enjoyable. Learning how to analyze a text and also learning how to use those elements in your own writing. With informational texts, similar, analyzing texts, understanding what makes a good source, a credible source, whether it's a book or something you find online, knowing how to use the table of contents and the index to find information, as well as chapter headings and photo captions, all those pieces that help you use a text efficiently and productively to find the information that you want to find.